Greetings, Westminster. Today we find ourselves 5 weeks, going on 6 weeks in the nationwide lockdown, quarantine, in these strange and uncertain times. And if you're anything like me, you may be struggling a bit with some frustration, anxiety, wondering when will this end? How do we make the best use of our time? We find our plans, our work disrupted. We find ourselves in close quarters with our family members, perhaps even isolated from loved ones. That makes it a trying, testing time, testing our patience, our endurance, and we're provoked by Scripture to ask, how long, O Lord? We're wrestling with questions about our health, our safety. When will the economy reopen? When will we return as God's people to regular worship? What will the new normal look like? But as we ask these questions, we would go back to Scripture to seek God's wisdom. So last time I was with you, I shared some thoughts from 1 Samuel 23, as we found David, a fugitive on the run from King Saul, and then visited by his friend Jonathan, who came to strengthen his hand in God, to remind him that the Lord had this, the Lord was going to preserve him and protect him and establish him on his throne. Well, I want to share today from 1 Samuel 30, which has an echo from 1 Samuel 23. And since that time, David has spared Saul's life twice, but unfortunately gave up hope of ever getting away from King Saul, and unfortunately fled to the Philistines to become effectively the servant of King Achish, fooling the king, in fact, fooling him so successfully that David would be his servant for life, that David and his men almost found themselves forced into battle to fight against their own people of Israel. And only the hand of God's providence spared David and his men through the means of the Philistine commanders who did not trust David, fearing that he would switch allegiances back to Saul during battle and take their heads. So the Lord spares David, but then as he and his men return home to Ziklag, they encounter an even greater crisis. 1 Samuel 30, verses 1 through 6. Now when David and his men came to Ziklag on the third day, the Amalekites had made a raid against Negev and against Ziklag. They had overcome Ziklag and burned it with fire, and taken captive the women and all who were in it, both small and great. They killed no one, they carried them off and went their way. And when David and his men came to the city, they found it burned with fire, and their wives and sons and daughters taken captive. Then David and the people who were with him raised their voices and wept until they had no more strength to weep. David's two wives also had been taken captive, Ahinoam of Jezreel, and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. And David was greatly distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him, because all the people were bitter in soul, each for his sons and daughters. But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. So David and his men, relieved from not having to go into battle against their own people, returned to Ziklag, only to find a great crisis. Their wives and children and all their livestock captured by the Amalekites. We can imagine the overwhelming grief that then turns to bitter anger, and David now finds himself in the greatest crisis yet, with his own men, consoling them with thoughts of stoning him to death. We can imagine David in his great distress, tempted to run, to hide, to fight, to fall into paralysis over regret for having made a poor decision by not trusting the Lord and going to live among the Philistines. But by God's grace, David did not succumb to the flesh. It says here in verse 6 that David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. When David was at bottom, when he had no other source, no other refuge, he turns to the Lord to find strength, hope, and renew his spirit to lead his men. He goes on in chapter 30 to inquire of the ephod through Abiathar, the priest. The Lord faithfully directs David and his men to pursue the Amalekites. They find an Egyptian servant along the way who manages to guide them to where the Amalekite camp is located, where they successfully recover all their wives, children, and livestock. Once again, the Lord delivers David out of his folly, out of his sin, but when he repented and turned to him, the Lord was faithful once again. And of course, without turning to the Lord, it could have been a very, very different story. David reminds us that when we are in crisis, when we are in difficulty, when we're tempted to be impatient, to succumb to regret, despair, and bitterness, we have one resolve: to strengthen ourselves in the Lord our God. I believe that David here was benefiting from his friend Jonathan, who earlier came to strengthen his hand in God. And that's what we need in a time like this. We need Christian friends to encourage us, to strengthen us. They need us to go and strengthen them. But ultimately, we need Christ, the true friend, who comes to strengthen us, to renew our hearts, to give us hope, to give us eyes to see and hearts to believe that the Lord is good and will be faithful through the crisis.